Inside Pelican Bay's SHU, where darkness replaces the sun. The door slams shut with a thunderclap of steel. Not a sound escapes. Not a scream. Not even a breath. It's June 2011, and deep inside California's northernmost prison, a man named Todd Ashker sits on the edge of a concrete slab, his bed. He hasn't seen direct sunlight in over a decade. The air in the cell feels thick, as if time itself stopped circulating. He presses his ear against the cold steel door, trying to catch a whisper from another cell. But all he hears is nothing. Then suddenly tap, tap, tap. A faint knocking echoes through the walls, a coded message sent through 20 inches of reinforced concrete. It's the only way inmates in Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, or SHU, can talk to one another. The message spells out a single chilling word: strike. Within days, thousands of inmates across California's most dangerous prisons would refuse food, a hunger strike that would shake the foundations of the state's prison system. But here in Pelican Bay's SHU, the heart of California's prison darkness, it wasn't just about protest. It was about survival. About what happens when human beings are buried alive and forgotten. Welcome to Pelican Bay State Prison, Crescent City, California, where daylight is a rumor and silence is punishment. This is inside Pelican Bay's SHU, where darkness replaces the sun. The Tomb of California. When Pelican Bay State Prison opened its gates in 1989, California officials called it a necessary tool to control the worst of the worst. Located just 13 miles south of the Oregon border, it was built in the middle of a cold coastal forest, a place so isolated that locals said even the ocean breeze seemed afraid to pass through. Designed for 2,280 inmates, Pelican Bay was divided into two worlds. The general population yard, where inmates worked, exercised, and followed the routine of any maximum security facility. And the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, a world buried within the prison walls. The SHU wasn't just another cell block. It was an experiment in total control. Each prisoner lived in a windowless, soundproof cell 8 by 10 feet, made entirely of concrete. The walls reflected no light, no color, and no warmth. The only objects inside: a concrete bed, a concrete desk, and a steel toilet bolted to the wall. Prisoners spent 22.5 to 24 hours a day locked inside. The remaining time, if granted, was a single hour in what guards called the dog run, a small, caged yard with high walls and a grated roof. The sun barely reached through. Inmates called it the box. Journalists called it California's black hole. The purpose behind the madness. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed during the height of the 1980s prison wars. Gang violence inside California prisons had reached terrifying levels. Groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla Family controlled entire facilities from the inside. Officials believed the only way to stop the killings was to cut off communication entirely. No phone calls. No contact visits. Even speaking to another inmate could get you labeled a gang associate. So the SHU became California's most extreme weapon. Prisoners deemed too influential, even without committing new crimes, were sent there indefinitely. No sentence. No trial. Just a classification. Once inside, getting out was nearly impossible. According to official state data, by 2011 over 1,100 inmates were being held in Pelican Bay's SHU, and more than half had been there for over a decade. Inside the cell. Imagine waking up every day to the same gray walls. No clock. No window. No sound but the humming of fluorescent lights. You don't know if it's morning or night. You mark time by counting meals, 3 per day, each slid through a small metal slot. A tray appears. A tray disappears. That's your only human interaction. Inmates quickly learned to survive in their minds. They built invisible worlds. Some drew intricate chessboards on the floor with toothpaste. Others practiced legal arguments, memorized case law, or wrote letters that would never be sent. But many, too many, simply broke. Prison psychologists later described SHU syndrome, symptoms of anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and self-harm triggered by years of isolation. Former inmate Danny Murillo, who entered Pelican Bay at just 18, said in an interview years later, "You start to forget what your mother's voice sounds like. You start talking to yourself, and answering back." Even the guards knew it was breaking people. One officer, who later spoke anonymously, admitted, "You could see it in their eyes. After a few years they'd stare right through you. Like you weren't even real anymore." The unseen battle. By 2011, the tension inside Pelican Bay's SHU reached boiling point. 4 years, inmates had been promised debriefing, a process to earn release back to general population. But there was a catch. You had to snitch. You had to name other gang members even if you weren't one. For many, that was a death sentence. So they stayed, year after year, buried in silence. And then came the breaking point. In June 2011, Todd Ashker and several others, including Danny Troxel, Sidawa Nantambujama, born Dewberry, and Arturo Castellanos, circulated letters through hidden channels, calling for a statewide hunger strike. Their demand was simple: end indefinite solitary confinement. By July 1st, over 6,600 inmates across California prisons joined them, refusing food in a coordinated protest that stunned the nation. The news broke on CNN, The New York Times, and NPR. For the first time, Americans heard about Pelican Bay's SHU not as a rumor, but as a real place of darkness. Even correctional officers admitted things were changing. One captain told reporters, "We were told this place was built for control. But I think it controls everyone, including us." Life during the strike. Inside the SHU, the strike turned daily routines upside down. Meal trays came and went untouched. Some prisoners passed out from dehydration. Others were dragged to medical units, force-fed through tubes. Still, the silence held. The tapping messages, once used to pass gossip, now carried hope. Tap tap tap. How many days? Tap tap. 14. Outside, protests erupted at California's Department of Corrections headquarters in Sacramento. Families held up photos of loved ones who hadn't seen the sun in decades. One mother's sign read, "My son is not an animal. He's a human being. Let him see the light." The pressure worked. By July 20, 2011, state officials agreed to review SHU policies and address 5 core demands. End group punishment. Abolish debriefing. Improve food and medical care. Increase education and programming. Expand communication and visits. But when negotiations dragged on, a second hunger strike erupted in September, this time with over 12,000 inmates participating. And Pelican Bay once again became ground zero. The system fights back. Behind closed doors, officials began cracking down. Mail was intercepted. Family visits were denied. Prison lawyers reported that letters from SHU inmates were mysteriously disappearing. Inside, some guards turned hostile. They mocked prisoners by sliding extra food trays under doors during the strike. Others threatened disciplinary action. But the men inside the SHU, many of whom hadn't spoken to another human face in years, found unity. That unity terrified the system. Because for the first time, Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't just a place of silence. It was a place of resistance. And that resistance was spreading. Darkness without end. By 2013, new lawsuits were filed. Ashker versus Brown, alleging that prolonged solitary confinement violated the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. During testimony, experts compared SHU conditions to psychological torture. One doctor testified, "It's the equivalent of placing someone in a coffin, but leaving them alive." Images of the SHU surfaced. Bleak hallways under fluorescent glare. Empty yards surrounded by 20-foot concrete walls. Cells so small you could stretch out your arms and touch both sides at once. When journalists finally entered the SHU that year, one wrote, "You don't walk into the SHU. You descend into it." In 2015, after decades of isolation, the case reached a historic settlement. California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement and review thousands of SHU cases. For the first time in years, some inmates stepped outside, into real sunlight. One survivor described the moment. "I closed my eyes. The wind hit my face. I cried." But not everyone left. Hundreds remained, deemed still too dangerous, or too influential. And Pelican Bay's SHU continued to operate, not as a secret but as a symbol. A symbol of what happens when control replaces humanity. Fade to black. Back inside the same cell where our story began, Todd Ashker sits with a pen, writing to his attorney. The hunger strikes have ended, but his isolation hasn't. He glances toward the vent, the same one where years ago he used to whisper to other prisoners through the pipes. Silence. He takes a breath and writes, "Tell them we're still here." The fluorescent light flickers. Footsteps echo down the hallway. And as the steel door closes again, that same sound that began this story, you realize something chilling. For some men inside Pelican Bay's SHU, darkness doesn't just replace the sun. It becomes the only world they know. Shadows beyond the walls. When the Ashker versus Brown settlement was announced in August 2015, reporters gathered outside Pelican Bay's towering front gate. Cameras ready, microphones in hand, waiting for something that felt like history. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, called it a new era. For decades, the SHU had been a hidden world, locked away from public view. But now, after years of hunger strikes, lawsuits, and global attention, the system had promised reform. Hundreds of men, some who hadn't seen the sky in 20 years, were told they'd soon leave their windowless cells. The iron doors were supposed to open. But inside Pelican Bay, not everyone believed it. The quiet after the storm. The first weeks after the announcement felt strange. The sound of metal on metal, the endless rhythm of the SHU, continued as if nothing had changed. Guards moved through the corridors, their radios crackling, their boots echoing. To the men inside, promises meant little. Inmates like George Franco, who had spent over 23 years in the SHU, later said, "We didn't celebrate. We'd been told before that things would change. Then nothing happened." The settlement called for the end of indefinite isolation, but implementation was slow, cautious, and buried in bureaucracy. Each inmate had to be individually reviewed, case by case, to determine whether they truly belonged in the SHU or could safely be moved to general population. For some, that review came within months. For others, it took years. The first rays of light. By early 2016, a small bus with reinforced glass pulled up to the transfer gate. Inside were 10 inmates, the first group cleared to leave the SHU under the settlement agreement. They weren't being released to freedom. They were simply moving to a different part of the same prison. But for them, it felt like stepping onto another planet. When the door opened, the sunlight cut across their faces like a blade. One of the men, later identified as Sitawa Jama, lifted his hand to shield his eyes. He hadn't seen direct sunlight in over 15 years. He would later write in an open letter to The Guardian, "It was like being born again. I could feel heat on my skin. For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry." Other inmates described simple sensations that felt overwhelming: the sound of seagulls, the smell of the ocean wind, the sight of clouds moving across the sky. Things most people take for granted had become almost mythical. The cost of freedom. But freedom, even inside the same prison, came with complications. Inmates who left the SHU found themselves thrust back into environments they hadn't known for decades. Some had never seen modern technology. Others no longer recognized prison slang, politics, or faces. One correctional officer remembered watching a SHU survivor stare at a vending machine in disbelief. "He looked at it like it was magic," the officer said. He'd never seen one before. These men had lived in sensory deprivation for so long that reintegration wasn't just emotional, it was neurological. Doctors at the University of California, Irvine, who studied former SHU prisoners, noted lasting cognitive damage: memory loss, hypersensitivity to light, and panic in open spaces. Some couldn't sleep without the hum of the fluorescent light they'd hated for years. Others avoided conversation, overwhelmed by noise. And while most Californians thought Pelican Bay's dark age was over, the truth was murkier. The ghost unit. Officially, the security housing unit was being phased out. In reality, many cells remained occupied. CDCR quietly renamed certain sections restricted custody general population. But the structure, the architecture of isolation, remained unchanged. Same concrete. Same lighting. Same absence of sunlight. Critics called it the SHU by another name. Inmates who had once been promised freedom found themselves transferred not to open yards, but to modified isolation blocks elsewhere: Corcoran State Prison, Tehachapi, Folsom, even newer, administrative segregation units. They were still confined 23 hours a day. Still eating alone. Still surrounded by silence. Todd Ashker himself, the man whose name was on the lawsuit, was among those who remained behind bars, still in isolation. When interviewed by the Los Angeles Times in 2017, he said, "They tell the public it's over. But I'm still here. So are many others." And he wasn't exaggerating. State data showed that more than 1,200 prisoners were still living under extreme confinement, the very conditions the court had condemned. A prison without shadows. Pelican Bay itself also changed, at least on paper. New warden policies emphasized step-down programs, where inmates could earn increased privileges over time. Prison officials began offering classes, therapy sessions, and limited outdoor access to some men. But inside, the culture of the SHU didn't vanish overnight. The staff who had worked in isolation units for decades were still there. Many believed that these inmates, gang affiliates, lifers, and convicted killers, could never change. An internal report from 2018 showed that some officers resisted the reforms altogether. They referred to released SHU inmates as the ghosts, because even when they walked outside, they still carried the silence of the SHU with them. Breaking the silence. In 2018, something unprecedented happened. Former SHU inmates began speaking publicly. They formed advocacy groups, like the California Families Against Solitary Confinement (CFASC) and End Solitary for Good, traveling to state hearings, giving interviews, and telling their stories to anyone who would listen. Todd Ashker's letters were published by outlets like Truth Out and Solitary Watch. Danny Murillo became an activist and scholar, graduating from UC Berkeley, turning his trauma into education. Sitawa Jama spoke at university panels, describing how isolation had changed his brain. Their message was unified. You can't bury people alive and expect them to come back the same. Their testimonies drew support from journalists, human rights organizations, and even lawmakers. By 2019, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture had cited Pelican Bay's SHU as an example of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. But inside California, the debate continued. Was solitary confinement necessary for safety, or was it a system built on fear? The human experiment. To understand the SHU, you have to understand how it rewired everything, not just the inmates but the entire prison ecosystem. Guards trained in that environment learned to see silence as safety. Movement was danger. Speech was risk. Over time, that logic spread. It created a culture where control was confused with order, and human contact with weakness. By 2020, researchers at Stanford and UC Davis were studying former SHU inmates' brains using MRI scans. The results were startling. Prolonged isolation led to shrinkage in areas of the brain responsible for empathy and memory. One neuroscientist described it as reverse evolution. Humans are social creatures. Remove that and the brain begins to eat itself. Meanwhile, Pelican Bay's SHU still stood, concrete, unchanging, indifferent to reform or science. A pandemic in the dark. When COVID-19 hit California's prisons in 2020, lockdowns swept through the system. Ironically, for Pelican Bay, it barely changed life at all. The men in isolation were already living under quarantine long before the world knew the word. But the virus brought new fear, fewer visits, suspended programs, delayed mail. The small slivers of human connection they'd fought for began closing again. In one letter smuggled out that year, an inmate wrote, "The world finally knows what it feels like to live like us. Locked away, cut off, waiting for something invisible to end." It was hauntingly true. For a brief moment, the outside world experienced what Pelican Bay had lived for decades. The long shadow of solitude. By 2022, many former SHU inmates had been transferred or released. Some rejoined society after 30 or 40 years behind walls. But reintegration wasn't simple. In Crescent City, local residents often recognized their faces from old mugshots. Some were afraid, others curious. One man interviewed by the Sacramento Bee said, "When I got out, I didn't know how to cross the street. I waited for the light to tell me what to do. For years, I'd only moved when someone else gave the order." Freedom, for them, felt more like disorientation. The world had changed. Smartphones, social media, self-checkout machines, all alien concepts. A few couldn't adapt and ended up back in prison, not for violence but for simple parole violations. They were institutionalized, programmed by years of silence and control. The legacy of the box. Today, Pelican Bay's SHU still stands, empty in some sections, active in others. The state calls it restricted housing. Former inmates call it the tomb. Documentaries, podcasts, and exposés have tried to capture it, but none can truly translate the feeling of being in a place designed to erase you. A journalist who toured the SHU in 2023 said, "The walls hum. You feel like the building itself is alive, but you're not. Each cell still bears marks, carved initials, hidden messages, small calendars etched into the concrete. Tiny signs that someone existed there, that the silence had been broken, if only for a moment." Outside, reform continues. Activists lobby for legislation to limit solitary confinement to 15 days, aligning with the United Nations Mandela rules. Inside, others wait. Men whose names the public has forgotten, living between concrete and memory. Closing the door. For now. As dusk falls over Crescent City, the prison's floodlights flicker on, casting long shadows across the razor wire. Somewhere deep inside, a man lays his head against the cold wall and listens. The tapping begins again. Not for hunger. Not for protest. But for connection. Tap, tap, tap. Still here? Tap. still here. And as that faint rhythm echoes through Pelican Bay's labyrinth of silence, one thing becomes clear. Even if the world has moved on, the SHU, and what it did to the human mind, still lives on. Invisible. Enduring. Unfinished. The shadow that spread across America. When Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit first opened in 1989, few outside California noticed. It was just another high-tech prison, another headline in the era of tough on crime. But over the years, as the doors of the SHU clanged shut behind thousands of men, what began as one prison experiment quietly reshaped the entire American correctional system. The philosophy was simple and terrifying. If you can't control them with walls, control them with silence. Birth of a model, how Pelican Bay became a blueprint. By the mid-1990s, prison administrators from across the U.S. began visiting Crescent City to study the SHU's design. They saw something remarkable, not chaos, not rebellion, but order. Every movement timed. Every voice muted. In 1994, a delegation from Colorado toured Pelican Bay. Months later, they began construction of ADX Florence, America's only federal Supermax prison. When it opened in 1995, reporters called it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But behind that name was Pelican Bay's ghost. Same windowless cells. Same steel doors. Same idea. Isolation as a solution. Former ADX warden Robert Hood once said, "It's not designed for rehabilitation. It's designed for absolute control." That philosophy spread fast, from Illinois' Tams Correctional Center, to Virginia's Red Onion State Prison, to Texas' Polunsky Unit, home to death row. Across the country, Supermax prisons multiplied. By 2000, over 44 states had built some version of Pelican Bay's SHU. America had adopted solitary confinement as policy, not punishment. The hidden war inside. Inside these units, an invisible war began. One fought not with weapons but with silence. Correctional officers learned to see isolation as the ultimate disciplinary tool. Inmates learned that even small infractions, talking back, refusing orders, or possessing unauthorized paper, could mean months or years in the hole. At Pelican Bay, isolation wasn't just about safety, it became part of the institution's identity. The SHU turned into a factory of psychological control. Inmates described a slow process of being broken down, routines so monotonous that they erased memory. You woke up. You counted the cracks on the wall. You waited for the food slot to open. You went to sleep. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years, until even anger became dull. One inmate wrote, "At first you fight the walls. Then you start talking to them. Then you start to miss them." Experiments in silence. By 2002, human rights groups were warning that long-term solitary confinement met the international definition of torture. Doctors studying Pelican Bay's SHU compared its effects to sensory deprivation experiments conducted during the Cold War. They discovered that after 15 days of near-total isolation, brain activity began to slow. After 30, inmates showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress. After 90, some hallucinated, hearing non-existent voices, seeing movement in the corners of their cells. A psychiatrist who interviewed multiple SHU prisoners said, "The human mind needs interaction the way lungs need oxygen. Without it, people begin to dissolve." But in the 2000s, politicians weren't listening. The fear of gangs and violence still ruled public opinion. So instead of scaling back isolation, many states expanded it. By 2010, an estimated 80,000 prisoners were in some form of solitary confinement in the United States. The human cost. Back in Pelican Bay, the effects were unmistakable. Letters smuggled out told stories of madness. Men cutting themselves just to feel alive, or saving crumbs from meals to feed invisible pets. Some began hearing voices through the vents. Others tapped endlessly at the walls, repeating the same rhythm for hours, not as communication but as ritual. A former inmate, Michael D., later described the mental collapse. The first thing you lose is your sense of time. Then your sense of self. You start to think the world outside isn't real anymore. Even the guards weren't immune. Some developed sleep disorders, depression, and substance abuse, symptoms of working daily in an environment designed to suppress emotion. One retired officer admitted, "After a while you start to talk to yourself too. You're not supposed to, but everyone does. That place changes you." The public awakening. For years, the SHU's reality stayed hidden. Then came technology, smartphones, YouTube, documentaries, and the truth could no longer be contained behind concrete. Leaked footage showed the stark gray corridors, the dog-run exercise cages, the emotionless routines. Advocacy groups began releasing letters, interviews, and photos from inside. People saw men aging inside boxes. They saw the toll of decades spent without human contact. By the mid-2010s, the narrative began to shift. The New York Times called solitary a prison within a prison. The American Civil Liberties Union called it psychological death. And in California, former SHU inmates began testifying before state committees, describing not vengeance, but transformation. They weren't asking for sympathy, they were demanding recognition. Recognition that Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't an outlier. Was a mirror. The power of the mind. Isolation didn't just destroy minds, it also created survivors. Men who learned to reshape their thoughts to endure. They built mental routines to simulate reality. Some recited books from memory. Others exercised obsessively, push-ups, squats, wall presses, anything to stay sane. Todd Ashker once described how he trained his mind to survive. I'd count everything, breaths, steps, bites. If you can't move your body, you move your mind. These coping mechanisms fascinated psychologists. They found that some prisoners developed superhuman focus, the ability to visualize entire environments in perfect detail. A 2017 Stanford study on Pelican Bay inmates discovered increased activity in the brain's visual cortex, suggesting that imagination had replaced sensory input. In simple terms, their minds created worlds their bodies could not enter. It was both inspiring and tragic. From Pelican Bay to policy reform. The exposure of Pelican Bay's SHU triggered national reflection. By 2018, several states, including Colorado, Maine, and New Jersey, began reducing solitary confinement. Colorado even abolished long-term isolation altogether. Governor John Hickenlooper famously said, "If we can't treat people like human beings, we shouldn't be in the business of holding them." But California lagged behind. Pelican Bay's SHU remained operational, though with fewer inmates. CDCR officials argued that some individuals, gang leaders, violent offenders, serial killers, were simply too dangerous for normal housing. Activists countered that even those people deserved humanity. The debate split the state. Supporters of reform pointed to the Mandela Rules, adopted by the United Nations, which define solitary confinement beyond 15 days as cruel and inhumane. Opponents pointed to safety, citing the legacy of gang wars that originally birthed Pelican Bay. To this day, that tension, control versus compassion, defines American corrections. The invisible export. Beyond U.S. borders, the Pelican Bay model influenced even foreign prisons. Security consultants shared best practices on inmate management, using the SHU as a case study in efficiency. Architects designed facilities in Brazil, South Africa, and the Middle East modeled after the SHU's pod structure. Small clusters of cells arranged around control booths for maximum observation and minimum interaction. What started as one California experiment became an international doctrine. But with it came the same consequences: rising mental illness, self-harm, and suicides. In 2019, Amnesty International released a report titled, "Buried Alive: Solitary Confinement Around the World." Pelican Bay was featured prominently, a warning and a precedent. Returning to the source. Despite global scrutiny, Pelican Bay itself remained largely untouched by the passing of time. By 2023, much of the facility still looked as it did in 1989. Concrete hallways. Fluorescent hum. Endless doors. But the people, those who had survived it, carried its shadow into the world. Danny Murillo lectured on prison reform at universities. Sitawa Jama became a voice for peace inside prisons, promoting meditation and nonviolence. And through his letters, Todd Ashker continued to remind the world that the fight wasn't over. One of his most recent messages read, "They can close the doors, but they can't close the truth. The SHU taught me that silence can scream louder than violence." The next generation. A new generation of inmates arrived at Pelican Bay, young men born after the SHU's creation, some unaware of its dark legacy. They entered a system still haunted by old ghosts. Older prisoners, survivors of the SHU, warned them, "You don't beat this place by fighting it. You beat it by staying human." Some listened. Others didn't. Fights still broke out. Gang tensions flared. But something fundamental had changed. The idea of total isolation, once accepted as normal, was now questioned even among the officers themselves. Training programs introduced new psychological methods. Conflict de-escalation, communication exercises, small group therapy. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Echoes in the dark. At night, Pelican Bay falls silent. The fog rolls in from the Pacific, pressing against the razor wire like a living thing. From above, the prison looks like a glowing square of light in an ocean of darkness. Inside, the walls hum softly, a memory of the thousands of men who once sat behind them. Every now and then, a sound breaks through, the faint tapping of a steel cup against concrete. A code older than the prison itself. Tap, tap, tap. Still alive. Still remembered. Because even as America moves forward, Pelican Bay's SHU remains an invisible monument. A reminder of how far we're willing to go in the name of control, and how hard it is to climb back toward humanity once we descend into the dark. After the walls, life beyond the SHU. When the gates finally opened for the men who had survived Pelican Bay's security housing unit, the world outside wasn't waiting with open arms. For many, release from the SHU didn't feel like freedom, it felt like stepping into another kind of cell. The sky was too bright. The sounds were too loud. And silence, their oldest companion, became a ghost that followed them everywhere. The first day out. In 2016, Sidawa Nantambujama walked across a yard for the first time in nearly 2 decades. A correctional officer watching from the tower said he moved, like someone on the moon, careful, amazed, unsure where gravity began. Sidawa later told a reporter from KQED, "When the wind hit me, I froze. I didn't know if it was real. For years, I'd only felt air through a vent." That single moment captured what psychologists call reentry shock, the collision between sensory starvation and a world overflowing with input. Across California, dozens of former SHU inmates experienced the same thing. A man named George Ruiz, freed after 24 years of isolation, panicked when a bird landed near him. He hadn't seen one since the 1980s. Another, Ruben Chavez, couldn't sleep in the dark. He needed fluorescent light to mimic the SHU's endless glow. They'd escaped the box, but the box hadn't left them, building a new life from fragments. Reentry programs tried to help, but few were prepared for men who hadn't touched a phone, hugged a family member, or stood in a crowd in decades. Community groups like All of Us or None and Legal Services for Prisoners with Children stepped in, pairing survivors with social workers, doctors, and mentors. Danny Murillo, once a Pelican Bay inmate himself, remembered the first time he helped another man navigate a grocery store. He kept saying the aisles were too long. He couldn't focus. Every sound felt like an alarm. Many found refuge in writing. Letters, essays, and poems became therapy. Some were published in the Huffington Post and Solitary Watch, turning their trauma into testimony. A few enrolled in universities. Murillo earned a degree from UC Berkeley. Sidawa worked with nonprofits promoting nonviolence inside prisons. Todd Ashker continued to litigate from behind bars, filing petitions for those still trapped in isolation. For the first time, their stories reached classrooms, newsrooms, and even the halls of state government. The political battle. After 2015, California lawmakers introduced multiple bills to regulate or abolish long-term solitary confinement. But the road was rough. Correctional unions warned that removing the SHU would endanger officers. They pointed to prison riots in the 1980s and 1990s as proof that strict isolation saved lives. Advocates countered with data. States that reduced solitary saw lower assault rates, not higher. In 2022, Assembly Bill 2632, nicknamed the California Mandela Act, proposed limiting solitary to 15 days at a time. It passed the legislature but was vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom, who cited security concerns. Outside the Capitol, protesters held signs reading, "15 days is enough," and the tomb. Among them were mothers, children, and former inmates wearing T-shirts printed with cell numbers instead of names. Their chants echoed the rhythm once tapped through concrete. Tap, 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 still here. The science of survival. Neuroscientists continued to study what Pelican Bay had created. A 2021 Stanford University paper used MRI scans of former SHU inmates and found measurable changes in the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory and emotional regulation. Long-term isolation, it concluded, caused functional atrophy consistent with chronic trauma. Another study from UCLA revealed that ex-SHU prisoners exhibited heightened stress responses to normal sounds: a door closing, a car horn, a voice raised in conversation. Doctors began calling it post-isolation syndrome. But amid the data were miracles, people who somehow endured. Their resilience baffled scientists and inspired activists. One psychologist who worked with former Pelican Bay inmates said, "They were supposed to disappear. Instead, they came back as witnesses. Inside the remaining walls." Meanwhile, back in Crescent City, Pelican Bay still hummed. The SHU wasn't empty. In 2023, roughly 150 inmates remained in restricted housing. Officials called it administrative segregation, not solitary. The terminology changed, the experience didn't. Reporters visiting that year described sterile silence, the same gray cells, the same hum of lights. A guard admitted off camera. "You can rename it all you want. It's the same box." The institution itself had become self-sustaining, too large, too political, too woven into California's corrections budget to simply disappear. Families of the forgotten. Outside those walls, families continued to fight for their sons, brothers, and fathers. Every summer, they gathered on the steps of the state capitol in Sacramento, holding photos of men still inside Pelican Bay. Some were mothers in their 70s, their hands shaking as they held banners reading, "Bring them to the light." For them, reform wasn't theoretical. It was personal. One mother, Gloria de la Cruz, whose son had been in isolation since 1998, said, "I don't want him to die in the dark. I just want him to feel the sun." Her plea went viral after a local news broadcast, reigniting public debate. The cultural reckoning. Films, documentaries, and podcasts followed. Netflix released The Box, Life Inside Pelican Bay in 2021, bringing millions of viewers into the claustrophobic reality of the SHU. YouTube channels dedicated to true crime began shifting focus from killers to the system itself, the architecture of punishment. What used to be hidden footage became mainstream fascination. The American audience that once craved prison shows for thrill now watched them for truth. The question had changed from "how dangerous are they?" to "what have we done to them?" The legacy in law. In 2023, a coalition of lawmakers reintroduced the California Mandela Act, stronger and clearer. It bans solitary confinement beyond 15 days statewide, with limited emergency extensions. This time it passed again, and again Newsom vetoed it. But national attention grew. States like New York and Connecticut adopted similar laws, inspired directly by the Pelican Bay movement. Even the Federal Bureau of Prisons announced pilot programs to reduce isolation at ADX Florence, a ripple from the same California tide. And behind every reform was the echo of that first knock on concrete. Tap, 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 strike. The survivor's mission. Todd Ashker, still incarcerated but no longer buried in total isolation, continued to write. His letters reached universities, journalists, and human rights lawyers around the world. One line became a mantra among activists: "Darkness can replace the sun, but not the will to see." Former SHU men visited high schools, warning students about violence, gangs, and the cost of anger. They weren't preaching fear. They were preaching empathy. In Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, programs like No More Boxes offered art therapy, mentoring, and public speaking platforms for survivors. Slowly, the narrative shifted, from prisoners to prophets, men who had endured the state's harshest punishment and turned it into a cause for humanity. The unfinished fight. Today, Pelican Bay still stands on the edge of the Pacific, a gray fortress wrapped in mist. It remains operational, housing some of California's most dangerous inmates. But to those who know its history, it's more than a prison. It's a monument to how far a society will go to feel safe, and how hard it is to reclaim its conscience afterward. Every few months, new bills surface in Sacramento. Each one carries the same question. Can a system built on silence ever be redeemed by reform? No one knows yet. But the movement that began inside a soundproof cell continues outside, in classrooms, courtrooms, and YouTube documentaries watched by millions. Because stories have power. And once the world has seen inside the SHU, it can't unsee it. Nightfall over Crescent City. Fog drifts in from the ocean again, curling around the floodlights. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cries, one of the few sounds that reaches the prison yard. Inside a cell, a man writes on lined paper illuminated by the flicker of a fluorescent tube. His handwriting is shaky but deliberate. They said this place was made to hold the worst of us. But it held all of us, guards, prisoners, even the ones who built it. I wonder if they ever realized, the walls didn't just keep people in. They kept light out. He pauses, then adds one more line. Tell them we're still human. He folds the letter, seals it, and slides it toward the slot. A guard's hand takes it, unreadable routine. The sound of steel echoes again. Somewhere beyond those walls, another hand will open that envelope. And when they read it, the darkness that once replaced the sun might begin at last to fade. When darkness speaks, America's moral reckoning. For decades, Pelican Bay State Prison stood as a fortress of silence. A place designed to hide what America didn't want to see. But by the 2020s, something began to shift. The same country that built the SHU was starting to question why it existed at all. And that question, how far can justice go before it becomes cruelty, echoed far beyond Crescent City. A nation looking in the mirror. In Washington, D.C., congressional hearings began addressing the long-term psychological effects of solitary confinement. Experts cited the same data that had once been dismissed: brain scans, suicide rates, cognitive decline. One of the most shocking statistics came from the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. Prisoners held in solitary confinement are up to 7 times more likely to die by suicide than those in general population. That number cut through political debate like a blade. Senators, governors, and even former correctional officials began to ask the unthinkable. Had the American justice system, in its pursuit of order, crossed into the territory of cruelty? For the first time, the Pelican Bay story wasn't a local scandal, it was a national symbol. Documentaries, op-eds, and social media campaigns painted the SHU not as a solution to crime, but as a reflection of what fear had built. From fear to policy. Back in the 1980s, when Pelican Bay was conceived, the national mood was one of panic. Crime rates were rising and politicians promised law and order. In that environment, solitary confinement became a political tool, an easy way to appear tough while hiding the human cost. But in the decades that followed, America began to realize that isolation didn't stop violence. It amplified it. A 2018 report by the Vera Institute of Justice showed that inmates released directly from long-term solitary were significantly more likely to reoffend, not because they were evil, but because they'd forgotten how to exist among people. Solitary wasn't making society safer. It was creating broken men and sending them back into the world. And so, the policy once praised for its control began to collapse under its own logic. The human voice returns. Inside the movement to end solitary, something remarkable happened. Survivors of the SHU became the most effective reformers. They didn't speak with anger, they spoke with quiet truth. In 2022, during a California Senate hearing, a former Pelican Bay inmate named Jose Villarreal testified before lawmakers. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. "I used to be invisible. The SHU made sure of that. But you can't fix violence by erasing people. You fix it by remembering we're still human." His testimony went viral, viewed millions of times on TikTok and YouTube. For younger generations, the SHU wasn't an abstract policy anymore, it was a human story. Faith behind bars. Even religion began to take notice. Chaplains, pastors, and rabbis who had once served in prisons joined the call for reform. One chaplain who ministered inside Pelican Bay in the early 2000s said during an interview, "When you walk those halls, it's like being inside a tomb. You start to realize, the light you bring in is the only light they'll see that day." Faith groups across the U.S., Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, began framing solitary confinement as a moral issue, not just a criminal one. They invoked scripture. Remember those in prison as if you were there with them. In 2023, the National Council of Churches formally condemned long-term solitary confinement, calling it an affront to human dignity. The same America that once justified the SHU in the name of order was now debating it in the language of the soul. The silence of the officers. The guards, the men and women who worked inside Pelican Bay, had their own reckoning too. Some defended the SHU as necessary. Others confessed that it broke them just as much as the inmates. A retired officer named Michael C., who had served 25 years in Pelican Bay, described his final day on the job. "When I turned in my keys, I sat in my car for an hour and didn't start the engine. The silence followed me home. I still dream in concrete." His story became part of a broader realization, that the SHU had not only punished prisoners, but infected everyone who touched it. It was a machine of control that demanded obedience from both sides of the bars. The global spotlight. In 2024, the United Nations Committee Against Torture revisited its earlier assessments of U.S. prisons, once again citing Pelican Bay as a warning. The report stated, "The United States remains in violation of international human rights standards concerning prolonged solitary confinement." International media picked up the story. The BBC aired a special titled, "Buried in Silence: The Pelican Bay Legacy." In it, they showed drone footage sweeping over the gray sprawl of Crescent City's coastline, fog swallowing razor wire, towers looming over forests, and the invisible question lingering. Can a society call itself free while keeping men in perpetual darkness? The moral weight. For Americans, that question cut deep. It wasn't just about prisoners anymore. It was about identity, about what justice meant in a nation that calls itself the land of the free. Law professors and theologians debated whether solitary confinement constituted civilized punishment or slow-motion execution. A Harvard ethics panel in 2024 framed it bluntly. If light is life, then darkness as policy is death by another name. The phrase went viral. Protesters printed it on banners. Former SHU survivors tattooed it on their skin. It became the new anthem of a movement that refused to die. The echo in art and culture. Artists began to reinterpret Pelican Bay's story through paintings, music, and film. In Los Angeles, a gallery titled The Box featured life-sized replicas of SHU cells. Visitors could step inside, the door closing behind them with a thunderous clang. Most couldn't last 5 minutes. Outside the cell, a quote from Todd Ashker glowed in red light. The SHU is not a place for the worst men. It's a place that makes men worse. Musicians, too, began weaving the story into lyrics. Hip-hop artists from California to New York referenced Pelican Bay not as legend, but as warning. The prison had become part of American folklore, a metaphor for power, silence, and endurance. The law awakens. By 2025, new bills resurfaced in state after state. New York's Halt Solitary Law, New Jersey's Isolated Confinement Restriction Act, and Colorado's 15-day limit all traced their lineage back to Pelican Bay's rebellion. In California, activists pushed again for a third version of the Mandela Act, this time armed with national momentum. The debate wasn't just policy anymore. It was conscience. One lawmaker said during the session, "This isn't about who deserves mercy. It's about who we become when we forget it." That moment made headlines. The vote was still pending. But something irreversible had shifted. The story that began in darkness was now guiding a nation toward the light. The sound of hope. Inside the remaining SHU blocks, few men remain. The cells are quieter now, but not silent. From time to time, guards still hear the soft rhythm of tapping, that ancient code that once sparked a revolution. Tap, tap, tap. Not protest. Not fear. Just remembrance. The walls that were built to erase voices have become monuments to them. And as the world outside argues, debates, and reforms, those inside keep the rhythm alive. A quiet reminder that even in the absence of sunlight, the human spirit still finds a way to speak. The last letter. In early 2025, a letter from Todd Ashker was published in the Marshall Project. It read in part, "If Pelican Bay taught me anything, it's that darkness is not the enemy. Forgetting is. We lived without the sun, but we never stopped believing in morning." That letter circulated online, shared by millions. College students read it aloud in classrooms. Journalists quoted it in editorials. Lawmakers cited it in hearings. It became more than a statement. It became a warning and a promise. Because the SHU, for all its cruelty, had revealed something undeniable: the human capacity to endure, to remember, and to rebuild. Epilogue: the dawn over Crescent City. Today, as dawn breaks over the Northern California coast, Pelican Bay still stands, massive, gray, unyielding. But through the fog, sunlight cuts across its towers, glinting off the razor wire. It's not a symbol of strength anymore. It's a monument to change. The same sunlight that once seemed unreachable now touches the walls that hid from it. And somewhere deep inside, in a quiet cell that once swallowed voices, a man sits with his back to the light and whispers a single word that has survived every year of darkness. Hope.